more people in jail, that doesn't rely on the standard forms of police use of threats and coercive force. I want problems solved in my community in positive ways that make the community and the individuals within it stronger, more resilient, self-sufficient, and treats them with as much dignity as possible. And that actually work, because so many of the things that police are doing don't work.
Just sort of a follow-up question, particularly the local situation here. I should also say that people haven't listened to Russell's Evolution Radio. We interviewed Alex last year when the book came out in October. As I'm sure, yeah, he has done also dozens of other interviews, but that's one of them that we did here at the WUC, local community radio station in Detroit. Anyway, so I wanted to sort of follow up on this question around if you think, Alex, that there's actually a qualitative difference between sort of big major cities and small cities, and the ways that so-called reforms or even abolitionist, non-reformist reforms which seek to rein in the power of the police to police solutions, right? So the police is often seen as a catch-all solution to social problems, as is the prison, right? But do you think there's a qualitative difference between how these reforms work in small cities, like in Arbor, in which city managers have an overwhelming amount of power to decide how the cities run, and how other cities run? If you've seen that in your research or decision.
So it's hard, we have over 18,000 police departments in the United States. And the vast majority of them have under 20 officers. So it's impossible to keep track of the variation. I tend to think about the conversation about police reform along more ideological lines, which is to say that there are certain rhetorical lines that tend to be consistent. So on the one hand, we have the kind of what we might call the Trumpist line, which is that police can do no wrong. Police are the thin blue line that keeps civilization afloat. Anyone who wants to reduce or in any way undermine police authority is enabling, criminals to run wild in the streets. And for that camp, it's very important that all social problems be defined as the result of individual or group moral failure that will only respond to punitive interventions. So this is characteristic of a lot of small town departments, sheriffs, rural areas, but not uniformly. Then there is the kind of professional policing framework that characterizes PERF, the Police Executive Research Forum, most of the big city departments, but a lot of small departments. And it's on a continuum, but most of these big city departments, the police chief's appointed by a Democratic mayor with a lot of votes from minority communities, not always, but often. And in some cases, primarily minority voters are voting in places like Detroit and Baltimore. So for that camp, the model is the one that we started with. It's the model of professionalization. That if we can just get the police to be less biased and to follow the rules we've laid out for them, that will restore community trust in the police, and we can continue to solve our community problems through policing. Because even they have embraced the politics of austerity as basically there is no alternative, and so we just have to manage the consequences of that, of the inequalities that austerity produces. And then the third framework is the framework that's aspirational, that's out there, that's a framework of community justice and empowerment and depolicing. So some people talk about it as an abolitionist framework, a depolicing framework, a community justice framework. And those folks are trying to directly challenge the politics of austerity and see the problems of policing as basically an extension of politics of austerity. And so my advice is that we need to shift our own efforts more in that direction.
So maybe maybe my first question would be, how do you recommend doing that? And then it leads to my second question. In a number of places in the book, you talk about the need for essentially a shifting of power at a community level. You mentioned things like community research, participatory budgets, reparations. There's an emphasis in places on sort of restoring the people power of unions at a local level. And so I'm wondering if you have any examples or insights about places in which organizing efforts have helped bring actually a little more of this power back to the people.
Okay, so there are a lot of examples of struggles in the U.S. that are being framed this way. I don't think we have a lot of concrete successes to point to. Internationally, though, we do have models we can point to that have resulted in depolicing and community empowerment to various degrees. And so we can look at like Portugal, which has decriminalized all drugs. Heroin, cocaine, ecstasy, the whole thing. And guess what? Civilization has not collapsed. The health outcomes are better. The police are not in the drug business anymore. It's a public health problem. In New Zealand, they have decriminalized all sex work, essentially. Take the police out of the sex work business. The outcomes for sex workers are better, there's less violence, standard of living is improving. It's not a panacea. There are still harms, there are still problems, but policing, getting police out has been very positive. There are major efforts underway all across the country to get the police out of schools. The Advancement Project has a brand new report that just came out last month that looks at, I think, 8 cities where there are major organizing drives underway to get the police out of the schools and redirect resources to making the schools healthier, more positive learning environments, etc., without relying on police. And that's one of the groups that's really embraced the depolicing model. That's a group that had been for body cameras and training and has seen that it doesn't work. The Center for Popular Democracy released a report early this year, also looked at about 8 or 10 cities across the country that have embraced campaigns to redirect resources from police and local jails into things like community-based mental health services, homelessness services, improvements in what's going on in the schools. So we do have a lot of struggles we can look at, and they're getting more and more attention. In Oakland, they've been trying to build up community resources so that people don't call 911 about low-level disputes, mental health problems, etc. I think this may be the subject of my next book, is just getting more into these details of these struggles and provide even more of these concrete examples. But I try to link to a series of them through the book as well. I'll just say also that the Advancement Project and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund has been working with folks in St. Louis and Ferguson, and they asked me to come out and meet with the local activists there in both places. And when I went to Ferguson, they've spent the last 4 years going to every police commission meeting and meeting with the DOJ and pressuring for the changes in the consent decree, and they have nothing to show for it. All these procedural reforms have really not provided any relief. And so we talked about what would a program of community empowerment look like. And what I said to them is, pick a ward. They have a ward representation system for their city council. Pick a ward where there's a well-meaning but ineffective reformer who's all for community policing, where there are real community problems that continue to be left unaddressed, whether it's drugs, mental health, failing schools, and start building a program around solving those problems without the police and making demands that these problems get solved without police. And let me tell you, sending 50 or 100 people to a city council meeting or a police commission meeting, that creates a little stir. You get an article in the newspaper. But basically, the mayor is very happy to have you protesting in that setting. Because that setting is designed to absorb all that energy and do nothing with it. But if you turn 100 people in a specifically defined neighborhood out to a meeting to say, our local officials have totally failed us in doing something about the opioid crisis, and we want safe injection facilities, needle exchange, and no police involvement, that will scare some politicians. But it's got to be neighborhood-based, and it's got to get real numbers of people out to a meeting that directly calls into question the authority and capability of specific elected officials. It doesn't mean that you have to immediately embrace electoral politics, though eventually I think that has to be part of the mix, but it cannot be couched as some kind of technocratic intervention. It has to be explicitly political. Our political leaders are failing us. And we want action, and we know what kind of action we want, and it does not involve the police.
Just wanted to, add a few other examples, concrete examples, and maybe have you comment on them. And two is sort of ask people here, but also you, counterposing police and politics to me. So even when we think about the mayor here as distinct from the police, I wonder if you think of precisely the mayor as exactly being the police, in that there is no possibility for disagreement as such, right? So if politics entails the capacity to disagree about the fundamentals of how society is structured, about what resources we decide to spend, how racialized bodies are policed or not, and so on, right? If those things cannot be disagreed on, then, and the function of the police is to maintain order, this racial capitalist order, then the function of the mayor is in many ways, at least here, but in other parts also to maintain order, right? So perhaps, I think, when we talk about the end of policing, we should maybe think about policing in a more expanded sense, for there to be something like politics as true disagreement, not just as the small p police, the police department, right? And sort of going on in that direction, perhaps I wonder if you can comment on some concrete examples, particularly in Chicago, such as the Chicago Reparations Ordinance, which gave more than $20 million, I believe, to victims of police torture in the city of Chicago for over 30 years. Black men and women that were tortured by the Chicago Police Department were given, in a sense, some reparations. So I wonder if you can comment on that as one concrete example, as well as other things that are happening there in organizations such as BYP 100, Black Youth Project 100, and others.
Okay, so which order? Okay, so Chicago. Chicago is very interesting. Now, the reparations thing is a really important victory, amazing community mobilization, but not necessarily transformative, right? It is an intervention for justice, and I think it's a model it's one model for what justice could look like.
Could you explain what it is? I'm not sure.
Okay, so there was a group of officers who were engaged in torturing people and part of interrogations, etc., and false confessions, and motivated by, we're going to get the bad guys. And these practices eventually came to light with sufficient robustness that they were able to bring civil litigation, and the city decided to settle, and the settlement included this language of reparations, but it was kind of paid out as individual level damages. And one of the things we've learned about lawsuits against police departments is that they don't lead to systemic change. Whether it's, you shot my brother, you shot me, you beat me up, none of that has fed back into systemic changes in policing any more than putting a few cops in jail has. So it needs to go to the next level. And I would have you know, personally maybe wanted to see that money put into community-based improvements that reduce the need for police rather than into the pockets of individuals. Though they certainly need the money and have certainly been treated with horrible unjustness. So, you know, that's not a statement I want to write an op-ed criticizing them, but in terms of a strategic conversation with them, I believe that. The BYP and other groups are pushing back on the gang suppression policing in really interesting ways in Chicago. The gang databases and the use of gang suppression policing to try to control the youth violence, and they've called concretely for investing in communities in very specific ways. Labor Bill of Rights and, you know, transfer payments and youth programs, and really strong analysis that goes much deeper than, well, we just need a, you know, a midnight basketball program or something like that, because the changes that are needed to fix this are big. So is the mayor just the police? So on the one hand, yes. On the one hand, yes, in the sense that the police are a tool of state government, you know, and it's the mayor that appoints the police commander, whatever, it's a commissioner, a chief, a sheriff, whatever. You know, some sheriffs are elected in some places, so that's more complicated. But in that sense, yes. But we must also understand that the police are also political players who have their own worldview and are not unified exactly. So that police commanders, chiefs, have one set of politics, but the rank and file may have its own set of politics, and they're quite capable of making those views known and exerting political influence through unions, fraternal orders, independent political action, and they endorse candidates and give money and say outrageous things. And so that can be a barrier to political accountability. But mostly I say, look, if anything, this book is as much a book about political accountability as it is police accountability. And part of the mistake we've made is that we've let well-meaning city council members, you know, march with us on the picket line when somebody gets killed, and then go back 6 months later and vote to expand the jail and hire 100 new police officers. And that is not police reform, and that is not making us any safer.
I just want to make a short point for those of us from the area, and that is that the reach of Chicago is kind of phenomenal. So the firm that came to Ann Arbor 2 years ago to do a sort of community policing research project, it was neither research nor about community. The head of the firm, Terry Hillard, was the head of the Chicago Police Department during one of the later cover-ups for John Burke, and then has since disappeared from this company's website. But the firm is staffed with former Chicago cops, including the former head of internal affairs. And Chicago has, I think, the highest police liability in the country, something like $500 million in the last 10 years. It's enormous. But then, you know, in a sense, they're actually, through these consultants that came to Ann Arbor, disseminating a sort of like model through the country.
Let me just say something about that, and then I'll get back to you. So there was just a piece this week, I don't know, it was in the Intercept or something. No, it wasn't, I forget. Anyway, Chicago, like a lot of cities, the majority of complaints, or the complaints and the shootings are disproportionately concentrated in a smaller number of officers. And so one of the ways that some reformers are responding to this is to create these algorithms to identify officers who are at risk of getting sued or committing acts of violence or whatever. And they're saying, well, Chicago hasn't been serious enough about identifying its high-risk officers. But nowhere is there any discussion in this article or in most of this discourse about what these officers are being asked to do when they commit these acts of brutality and misconduct. Well, it turns out they're heavily concentrated in specialized units like narcotics, gun interdiction units that are precisely charged with the mission of being at war with the public. And it's not really an accident that they are the ones who commit the most shootings and arrests and everything else. And it's not an accident that they generally end up getting rewarded for that behavior, not penalized, because they are in fact doing what they were told to do. And so Chicago has no interest in addressing those dynamics, but they do want to make money selling algorithms and these other things that are not going to make any difference.
So my question actually would be if you can, reflecting on your book and your work, if you can harness whatever predictive power you have to imagine something that's happening now that in 10 years we'll look back and say that was a critical moment that we missed to understand how policing was expanding in society. So I'm thinking of some examples from the book. No Child Left Behind, for example. Or you mentioned under Johnson, reform efforts that then led into like an expansion of money for SWAT and essentially transfer of funds to police departments that were largely unaccounted for. So I'm wondering if, and there could be many things right now that would set off all of our, raise our hairs that it's going to be this thing. But if you would imagine what are some things happening now that in 10 years look back and say this was, we missed that opportunity to rein in something that is now. Because one of the things I think that's been happening in my life is, if I look back, is actually I can see how police and the police state are intervening in larger and larger swaths of American life. They're obviously intervening in more harmful ways in some of the same places they have been for generations, if not since the beginning of policing. But they're expanding everywhere, like policing schools, for example. This would be a good example that's kind of recent. So it's kind of a dark question.
I mean, my first reactions are fairly obvious ones. I mean, body cameras is going to turn out to be a really horrible development. The research is coming in that it's not going to reduce use of force, arrests, citizen complaints. It's they had this big study in Washington, D.C. where they paired neighborhoods. Some got body cams, some didn't. They were otherwise demographically similar. Over a couple of years, they looked at the outcomes and they're like, guess what? There's no difference between the neighborhoods in terms of complaints, use of force, arrest rates. The body cameras had no effect on the policing. And the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police said, yeah, but we love them. We want more. We're going to give them to everyone. Why? Because they're great for evidence collection. We're using it to gather evidence on people to make convictions easier. And the body camera companies are saying to their stockholders, stick with us because the future of this is to pair it with facial recognition technology, geolocational coding, and then we can create databases where you can say, well, show me the pictures of all the gangbangers that were hanging out at 25th and 3rd over the last 6 weeks, and boop, 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 there are all the images, and now we know who they are, and we can create a big RICO conspiracy case and do an injunction or whatever. So that one's I think, going to be one that we look back on, and all these well-meaning reformers who call for body cams are going to be really regretting it. And we will have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on this technology that could have been spent on affordable housing and community-based mental health services and better schools and all of that. I think that the border regime, the penetration of ICE into more and more parts of our everyday lives is creating a space for a certain kind of federal policing. The border is everywhere now, and everyone is subjected to this potentially. Of course, it's highly concentrated in certain neighborhoods, but a certain kind of logic, I think, is being unleashed here, and the size of these bodies is being increased. The constitutional protections are being undermined, etc.
Sort of going on with this question, I mean, sort of part of the book traces the emergence of police through various regimes of accumulation, capital accumulation, colonialism, slavery, and the industrial working class. But that has shifted in the past 40 years towards flexible patterns of capital accumulation, but also a different racial order, right? And yet, I think insofar as there's this kind of the argument that as it's being structured right now is sort of universalizing force of police. It is interpolating or, in a sense, hailing more bodies than it used to, perhaps, right? And at the same time, it is, of course, not everybody bears the brunt of state power in the same way, right? People that don't have papers, and particularly black and brown folks, particularly black folks, right? And so I think there's something that I think we didn't really touch on, which is there's something irreducible about police violence, which is fundamentally about the racial structure of this country, which is about the gratuitous violence of police, right? So it is not only just about, I think, the structural sources that are spent, but the founding violence, anti-blackness, that founds and continues to reproduce in society, right? In which I think technocratic reforms, as well as all the language around risk assessments and all the language around cameras, make it impossible to talk about as such, right? Because ultimately, all these systems all these technologies are race blind, right? And so I think that's also another challenge that we're facing is that we're using predictive policing, we're using algorithms, right? And so now that's supposed to be race blind, in Chicago, for instance. Or we're using technologies which I think hide the fundamental anti-black character of policing in the history of the United States. So I wonder if you comment on that is not, policing I think is also about racial control, and I think that's a challenge also fighting against policing in predominantly white cities as well. Just as a political challenge as well, right? I mean, I think not everybody, insofar as policing has expanded, it has not actually expanded as much as we sometimes make it out to be, right? And I think that plays a challenge in how you organize, right, as well.
So, you mentioned the connection between policing and regimes of accumulation or exploitation, and we hear a certain discourse in activist circles about, well, police are just an extension of slave patrols. And that there is some truth to that, and I actually go into that history in some detail in places like Charleston, South Carolina, etc. But I spent just as much time pointing about how the roots of policing are tied to colonialism and industrialization, because there were no black and brown people in London in 1829 when the London Metropolitan Police were created. This is not to say that British society didn't rest on racialized capitalism, it's just that all those people were in other places being exploited in the New World and in Africa and other places. So we can have policing without racism, and that's very important. Also, you mentioned the brunt of policing directed at black people, but the outcomes for indigenous populations are much worse even today. The highest rates of police killings per capita, etc., still occur among indigenous populations.
So the Red Nation folks talk about it in New Mexico, for instance.
That's correct. Yeah. That's correct. And at the origin of American society is not just slavery, it is the extermination of the indigenous population, settler colonialism. And there can be no doubt that history is part of the dynamics that we experience today. The politics around gun violence and the need to have weapons and stand your ground, all that has to be understood as in the legacy of settler colonialism and slavery. This idea that there are dangerous populations that will only respond to deadly force. So we have to acknowledge those histories and those realities if we're going to make progress. So we cannot have police reform that doesn't have a racial anti-colonial analysis attached to it, because it won't be successful. It will turn into technocratic reforms. So I often say I'm not here to turn you all into police justice reformers. I'm here to turn you into racial and economic justice reformers. You all already are, so I don't mean to imply that I'm here to do anything to you, but just, I speak at popular audiences and college campuses and stuff like that, and that we can't be police reformers without having a racial and economic justice analysis. And that's really what I brought to this project that's so lacking in the police scholarship. Because I'm technically a police scholar. I'm known internationally as a police scholar, and I write in technical journals and write peer-reviewed pieces and do quantitative studies. So and I've done research for police departments and consulting and all of that. So, you know, a lot of people were very upset about the book because I was like an insider who turned against them in this very visible public way. And so they've been trying to figure out what to do with me because they can't say, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Because they know that I do, that I spend time in police cars and police stations, I read all the books and all the literature, and I do know what they do, and that's why I know that it's so unjust.
Okay. How much more time do we have for our questions, or do you want to?
I would say maybe about 10 more minutes, and then we can take some questions from the audience.
Okay. We've covered a lot of territory, so maybe I'll build off of the last question. I mean, Ann Arbor poses, you can see that many of my questions have had to do with organizing, and organizing, questions around organizing that are happening in the U.S. What's happening in Ann Arbor is quite challenging for a number of reasons. One is that it's a majority white city with a group of people organizing around police. The organizing that was happening 4 years ago was around a specific incident where a resident in Ann Arbor was killed by police, and her name was Ora Rosser. And then the organizing has moved into police accountability and justice in a variety of forms. So one of the questions I would have to this question of race is, and some of the things that you mentioned today already are led by or predominantly involve people of color and black people in the U.S. organizing around policing. And I'm wondering if you have examples of other possibly multiracial or white organizing around policing. I mean, one of the challenges in Ann Arbor actually is that the organizing, and we're not all white, but there are many white organizers doing this work right now, is that it's read as an ideological project, right? And that's actually what the mayor and city officials have used quite cynically. That this is just an ideological project, this is actually going to be harmful to black people because it's just white people on some communist socialist thing, right?
I heard you were all anarchists, so I don't know what
Right,
you're talking
well. The latest thing is that the organizers are actually bullying the city officials, all kinds of stuff around that. And it's been used really effectively, right? So the argument we would make is that this isn't entirely ideological, but it's ideological even for people affected by police. These things can cross over. It can be experiential and political and all different things. So I'm wondering, again, if you have more examples to share with all of us that might deal with the difficult demographic problems we have where we should be organizing around these issues in Ann Arbor. White people should be organizing on these issues, but in ways that would be effective and the least harmful for those most impacted by police, which is something that we're struggling with in this particular case. It's almost sorry.
What you do is ideological, and what I do is just practical.
Right.
That's very important for you to keep that in mind. Yes. Okay, so you know, it's always tricky to plop in from out of nowhere and start telling local activists how they should be organizing their work. So, so I understand that, and so everything should be taken with a grain of salt or whatever. There are problems in white neighborhoods in Ann Arbor that are not being addressed adequately and that police are being asked to pick up the pieces.